things. Coco is crash. Crash. Biohacking, there's so many things to think about.
Hi everyone, welcome to this week's episode of 16 Minutes. I'm Sonal and I'm excited. Hosted by our crypto editors, Message. Also a reminder that during the launch of this investment advice, we share non-disclosures for more information. But first, we cover the news that broke just this weekend, which apparently led to a national security council meeting in the White House on Saturday, confirmed by the Secretary provider on Sunday, which was that hackers spied on U.S. Treasury and other federal agencies with malware installed by a third-party provider. It was the largest hack of government systems recently, or even ever. We don't know the whole that it was still a developing story, but we do know that hack was solved. Several other customers, Pentagon, Justice, State Department, Commerce Department, and many companies as well. The National Security Council will first issued a statement on Twitter yesterday that they are working closely with the cybersecurity and infrastructure agencies, FBI, intelligence, affected departments, and agencies to coordinate a swift and effective whole-of-government recovery and response to the recent compromise. So, that's a high-level summary. Now let me introduce our A16Z expert for the first segment, who is Joel De La Garza, former Chief Security Officer and A16Z's operating partner for security. Welcome, Joel.
Thank you for having me.
Good to have you on. Fortunately, you haven't been on so much lately, and unfortunately, you've been on a little too much this year. There's been so many breaches. Speaking of, let's put this in perspective. And can you quickly tell me, I feel like we hear about different types of breaches all the time at your forum. How would you put this on the perspective of, is this a big deal or not?
Well, I think in the last 5 minutes it was reported that the Department of Homeland Security was also breached. So I would say,
oh no.
Stay tuned. You're going to see a lot more government agencies and commercial businesses that have been compromised by this. There's kind of two real reasons why this is a huge deal. The first is that this is probably the most sophisticated publicly disclosed attack we've seen since 2014. And that's when Russia targeted the White House and the Defense Department and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and got access to a lot of their unclassified IT systems. So this is probably the largest breach that we've seen in our nation state that's publicly reported since 2014 and 2014. But pretty substantially compromised not just Treasury, but probably will end up being hundreds of companies, multiple governments around the world. And the second is, it's particularly troubling to see this kind of a wholesale escalation and transition power from one administration to the other. These are typically periods of weakness, adversarial speech will let them active during them. And so this could potentially be part of the product campaign. We're going through a relatively contested presidential transition here in the United States. And so seeing any kind of hostile nation state activity in this period is very concerning.
So let's go into the details of who, the what, and the how. Now, traditionally we always talk about in the security world, we know that it's acquired, we know that on the show, attribution is hard. Do we know who did this, and do we know what happened technically and how they got in?
Yeah, so attribution is probably one of the more difficult things to do, and even governments spend billions of dollars trying to do attribution generally get it right. But the initial report indicates that it's right from Russia, and I believe that some folks have tagged the agency who one or post there as being involved in this. What we do know is that some malicious actors were able with figures to compromise an IT software vendor named SolarWinds that named network performance management and monitoring tools. They compromised it sometime, but this was in 2015, and were able to get access to their code base, so the code that they ship to their customers. And they were able to insert a malicious DLL or library into the code that basically
to orient that in terms of the show's theme of what hyper's real in terms of the tech trends in security? Like, where does this fit in the category of all the hacks out there, and where do you sort of see this fit?
The security industry in general likes to kind of chase the new news and sort of focus on the problems that are coming in the pipe. But, in reality, one of the biggest challenges with information security is actually securing your supply chain. As a business, you're essentially dependent on all these people that supply you to run and operate that business. So that when you have a vulnerability in that chain, and it gets exploited, especially by a sophisticated attacker, it means that all the businesses that rely on that third party are also exploited.
Right, and by supply chain, you're not talking parts and a phone kind of supplies. You're literally talking about third-party providers of all the services that companies rely on to do business.
Absolutely. It could be anything from the services that you use, your cloud services, whatever they may be, to the software that you purchase. It could even be the open source libraries that you use. What the attackers ultimately did was they were able to insert some malicious code into a DLL, which is public cloud. The code essentially created a command and control infrastructure where it would reach out and look for new orders for updates.
By the way, by DLL, you need a dynamic link library?
That is correct.
And is that a Windows-only thing, or is that something that's like ubiquitous across all systems?
This was a Windows-specific attack. It was an attack that was specific to software that was running on Windows.
Great. Well, not so great, actually, but thank you for that explanation. So, Joel, before we wrap up, what are practical considerations in terms of what companies can do of all sizes, big and small? What are practical considerations for chief security officers, government policymakers? What should people know?
Yeah, this is probably one of the more difficult problems in the professional space, which is securing your environment from your third parties. All the people who you rely on to run your business, you also rely on the users. Any breach of one of them is a breach of your company. And so in the enterprise, we are focusing on building a third-party review process, establishing a review through your vendors, making sure that they meet the security requirements for us, and then applying additional compensation control so that in the event that one of your management systems tries to reach out to the internet or to a malicious attacker's website, it can't, right? So I think it's about that comprehensive layered approach, having good programmatic hygiene in the way that you build and operate your program, and making sure that you kind of learn it that way.
Bottom line it for me, Joel, given that this is a fast developing news cycle, is there anything that you expect we should look ahead for, like in terms of the scope of the attack or what we should expect as we see this developing story? What's the bottom line?
Bottom line is that we're going through a historically vulnerable period for our country. We're going through this presidential transition that's been contested. That means that our adversaries are more likely to try to do something that would potentially hurt us, and this is something that will likely continue for the coming months.
Well, Joel, thank you for joining this segment of 16 Minutes.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Zorn. Our second segment today is about the recent news that the initial phase of ongoing upgrades to Ethereum is now live. This first step, called Beacon Chain, is part of a multi-phase overhaul for Ethereum called ETH 2.0, which is aimed at making the network more scalable and changing its security framework. The overall trend we're talking about here is blockchains and crypto. Ethereum is the blockchain launched in 2015 that introduced a flexible, general-purpose programming language that enables smart contracts and DeFi or decentralized finance applications. The news of the latest upgrade is relevant given that DeFi has been in the headlines. Protocols for trading, loaning, and borrowing cryptocurrency have surged in the past year. Ethereum previously saw a major growth phase in 2017 when the ICO boom and the sudden popularity of the game CryptoKitties made Ethereum more mainstream, but also put stress on the network. A16Z crypto partner Ali Yahya joins me to do a quick explainer on the news, beginning with why it matters.
CryptoKitties infamously was too much for Ethereum to handle. It basically almost led to Ethereum grinding to a halt because of high fees for people to submit transactions. It's just like a very congested network as a result. And then this is again come to the fore more recently because various decentralized finance, what people know as DeFi on Ethereum, have recently taken off.
So, what are some of the limitations we're talking about with Ethereum?
They have to do with performance and scalability. And there are three key things. One of them is the number of transactions per second that Ethereum can process. Today, that's around 10. And if you compare that to like a payment network like Visa, then the number for Visa is something much, much larger. The second factor is the time to finality. How long do you have to wait before you know that your transaction is final? And then the final one is the cost per transaction. How much do you have to pay for each transaction that you submit to the network. And so it is impressive that DeFi has gotten to where it is today, especially given that the infrastructure is still limited.
And the news here in recent days, and the reason we're talking about it here on 16 Minutes, was the launch of Beacon Chain, which is phase 0 of this ETH 2.0 upgrade, and it's directly aimed at fixing these limitations. So how is it doing this?
There are two major things that Ethereum 2.0 introduces that collectively address the three limitations. The first one is that it enables a transition from proof of work today to what's known as proof of stake. So today, comes from what's known as proof of work, which means that miners expend enormous computational power to secure the network, thereby ensuring that if an attacker wants to subvert the network, they also have to expend an enormous amount of computational power that's commensurate with that of the entire network to be able to subvert it, to be able to game it or cheat it. The downside of it is that it's very energy inefficient, and it has also performance limitations in that if like, the time to finality, for example, ends up being low, you have to wait like many minutes before you can trust that a transaction has been finalized on the blockchain. Proof of stake gets around this by no longer requiring the participants, the validators, to expend computational energy, and instead it requires them to just buy the asset of the network, in this case it's ETH, and lock up the ETH to vote for valid transactions. And so it's a similar security model, but instead of physical resources in the real world, you use a virtual digital asset. And virtual, therefore, it's just economically more efficient than something like proof of work. And what that'll do is that it'll improve the cost per transaction, because now the network's more efficient, and so validators can afford to charge lower fees for transactions. And the second thing is that it will improve the time to finality down from several minutes today to just seconds. The second aspect of Ethereum 2.0, alongside proof of stake, is sharding. And what sharding means is that instead of having every single miner or validator on the network today have to process every single transaction, as it is the case for Ethereum today, you can instead begin to split up the work and to have certain subsets of validators process certain transactions and not have to validate all of the transactions of the network. And then what that will do is that it will help address that third concern of transactions per second, and it will help increase the throughput of Ethereum from, say, today 10 to 15 transactions per second to hundreds of thousands of transactions per second.
Okay, so let's take a step back and take a broader view here about what this all means. So it's great that these network congestion issues will be addressed and that this should make transactions quicker and cheaper. But what does that mean for innovation in crypto? What's going to change as a result in terms of new use cases?
Only some subset of users and only some subset of applications continue to make any sense on top of Ethereum if it's congested. And by reducing congestion, by increasing scalability and improving the performance of the blockchain, all of those applications that stop making sense again become sensible. And then you can go further. Like there may be kinds of applications that don't make sense even in an uncongested Ethereum that might make sense if Ethereum were to scale 10x or 100x. This parallels what has happened in the history of computing all throughout, in that whenever someone comes up with some architecture that improves upon the previous one by 10x, the kinds of applications that can now be built on top of that computing platform just qualitatively change. They don't just become 10x faster. A whole new set of applications all of a sudden become possible. Today, Ethereum has really only been successful at supporting applications that are squarely within this decentralized finance category. And in part is because those applications tend to not depend so strongly on higher performance, like higher throughput and lower latency of finality. People can afford to pay high fees for a loan that they're taking from one of these lending platforms, where and they don't mind necessarily waiting many minutes for that to happen. Whereas if we were trying to build something like a game, where like the interactions that a user might want to have
has to be split second, has to be instantaneous.
Yeah, exactly. Like the performance requirements end up being different. And so the implication is that if you lift these constraints, then all of a sudden a whole new set of entrepreneurs who have different ideas about what to build on top of blockchains can now actually build those things. It may just be the case that today those things are just not possible with the current infrastructure.
So this is a big deal in the crypto community. Let's talk about what's really real here. We're not going to see any immediate changes.
That's exactly right. The beacon chain doesn't actually help just yet. It's just the first phase of a longer roadmap to eventually improve Ethereum in ways that will address these problems. But for now, the beacon chain as it exists today kind of acts like a conductor for an orchestra, but the orchestra isn't there quite yet. And the subsequent phases will introduce like all the musicians and all the instruments, and eventually a sharded version of Ethereum that's proof of stake and not proof of work will exist. But right now, the beacon chain is like it's just like the first building block, and in the coming years, the subsequent phases will come to pass.
So bottom line for us, what should people take away from this?
This development just brings us closer to a world in which blockchains are able to handle applications that are much more than just purely financial. They could include things like crypto-enabled games or more general web applications, and that's just the future that we're very excited about.
Ali, thank you for joining us in 16 minutes.
Thanks, Oren.
Ah.
Hi everyone, welcome to this episode of 16 Minutes. I'm Sonal, your host, and this is our show where we talk about the news, what's in the headlines, including orienting where we are on the long arc of innovation, especially given that the topic of this episode is Apple's most recent One More Thing event, where they announced the first new lineups of devices last week based on Apple Silicon M1 chips, and those officially came out today. So there's a lot of analysis of performance, benchmarks, and more. But in this episode, Steven Sinofsky, who has a bit of history to bring to bear here, both as witness and participant, joins us to cover the big picture, which is Apple's moving away from Intel chips and to their own chips that run on the ARM instruction set. So he goes both backwards and forwards from this point in time, beginning first with a quick history of Apple chips spanning decades, and then going into the implications for consumers, developers, and the industry as a whole. As a reminder, none of the following is investment advice. Please see a6nz.com/disclosures for more important information. And in case you missed it, also check out our related past 16 Minutes episodes on NVIDIA plus ARM, as well as other episodes on Apple Watch and more, all available in this feed. But just to sum up at a very high level before we begin what was announced as context, Apple's first Mac silicon chip is called M1 and features 8-core CPU for high performance for high efficiency, and up to 8-core GPU, has 16 billion transistors, and more. Anand's Andre Kumusanu has a couple great write-ups digging into the performance details, which I'll link to in the show notes. Devices-wise, they announced a new M1-powered MacBook Air that's fanless, a new Mac Mini, and a new MacBook Pro, among other things. So, Stephen, let me just start by asking you to share why this is interesting, why it matters, or why anyone should care.
Well, you want to care because these are computers that a lot of people use. And it matters a lot to the industry overall because this is an announcement that hits right in the square of the long-standing ecosystem of Microsoft Windows and Intel processors, which years ago Apple joined when they made Intel-based Macs. And this really goes way back to Apple's core, no pun intended, to be completely integrated from chips all the way on up. And back in the day, that was a huge thing. Like which chip the company used, who they bet on, everybody would debate it, talk about it. Early reviews of Mac versus Microsoft and IBM PCs were always focused on the chips. And Apple went for a long time on Motorola chips. And then in 1995, they take the Motorola chips as far as they could, and the IBM PC had exploded, and the Windows 95 was coming out. There was just no hope to keep up with this performance that Intel and the scale that Intel had and the economics that Intel had in chips, because in chips, everything is about scale. Like the more chips you make, the cheaper you can make them, the cheaper computers are, the more that you can improve manufacturing. It's just a cycle. And that cycle is called Moore's Law, as everyone knows. And for a long time, the saying was always, what Moore did with Microsoft, take it away. And so for what was going on was that tons of new processor capabilities would come out and speed, and then the software would grow to absorb any of that. So you never really had a fast computer that lasted a long time, because then the next software upgrade would just make it slow again. So that was the era when Apple was falling behind. So that's when they had to bet on a new chip. And they didn't pick Intel. They picked a chip called PowerPC because they could have more control over it. Again, that's that long-term goal to be in control of the chips. And it did okay, but it never changed the dynamics for Apple. And then because they never achieved scale that Intel had, they just got steamrolled when it came to what then was all about price and performance.
Yeah.
Then, in 2006 or so, Apple bet on Intel chips. And that was a huge deal, because now they could finally ride that price performance curve with Intel. But, the PowerPC, the Motorola 68K, the Intel x86, even the transition to 64-bit, they're all kind of the same architecture. They're really big central processing units that connect up to peripherals, and they take a lot of power. In that same period of time is when Apple discovered the value that ARM processors could bring to computing. They had run this with the success of the iPod, and then they saw what happened with the iPhone. In a sense, they'd seen a whole different approach to silicon. And so that's why this is so big, because it's not just another chip. You had a whole computer built on a different architecture, and that architecture is the system on a chip, or SoC, or SoC, and that takes all of those different parts of what used to be called the motherboard, it puts them all basically on one silicon die. And all of a sudden, that changes the whole dynamic for how much power the chip consumes, and so the performance is caught up on these chips, and it does so by using way less power. And we experience this every day on our phones, and so what's really happened is that whole equation of the software expanding to use all the CPU cycles, that's all gone away, and everything is sort of moved up the stack. Now people, they want, their photos to be processed much faster, and that processing takes place on a dedicated imaging chip, or they want machine learning to run in the background, which happens on another dedicated piece of silicon, which is all part of that same system on a chip. That doesn't happen on Intel-based PCs. Like there aren't those capabilities being built into the hardware in the same way across the hardware, the software, and all the places you can buy computing.
If you just take a step back, when we talk about Moore's Law, it's a very anodizing word, but OMFG, 16 billion transistors, like, holy moly, 8-core GPUs in a mobile personal computer. Like, what?
Yeah, I think about like the IBM mainframe that was at the airport when I was at Cornell. Like it needed so much power and so much cooling that they put it at the airport. And it was 4 megabytes of memory.
I know, it's amazing.
So yeah, that was Moore's Law. But this is the stack of hardware and software. Like that's the part that they're changing where the boxes are in the architectural diagram of the computer. And that's really important. In a sense, the trajectory that you're seeing with the A-series chips on the phone and now the M-series chips on the PC, it's just leaving behind what's going on Android and on Windows.
So it's interesting because the images, and I'll include them in the show notes, they have a slide, and every time they talk about Apple Silicon, where they show the entire system on a chip and all the different capabilities and how they kind of integrate together, and it's really, really compelling. One thing I want to take us back to, though, Stephen, just going back to the big picture, you also said that this is one of the biggest announcements in computers in a long time, that it represents a step function generational change, which you just summarized. And you said, though, that early on people will focus on the transition, but the real impact is the direction this takes things.
Well, what's interesting is that in some ways this is the end. Like it took all of this time to get to Macs built with basically the iPhone chips. And so you can think of it as at the end, like they finished. But if you look at the devices, they're really at the very, very beginning of what's possible in this transition. You know, the devices themselves that they announced were barely down the middle. Like there's nothing striking about like, oh my god, this is what you can do with computers now. But on the other hand, like even something simple like the webcam, it's still a 720p webcam that had access to the same image processing capabilities that they use in the phone and the iPad, which is more silicon and software integration. And that's before you start talking about the fact that these chips are much smaller, they give off less heat, they don't require cooling. Like all of this stuff is just getting started. There's so much sort of like, well, we did it that way because that's the way we had to do it. And it totally changes the whole equation. And so what I think we're going to start to see really innovative views of what the form factor could look like. And here we are looking at computers with like literally all day battery life, not the way that they define all day battery life in reviews. This is like you can just watch a movie all day.
So it's like 18 to 20 hours, which is literally all day, as you say.
The battery life is going to be ridiculous. I bet you'll get, 8, 10, 12 hours of like compile, edit, debug, test coding in on these machines.
A question that you've long been obsessed with is the convergence between tablets and PCs. Do you want to say a bit more about that?
Sure. Famously, Steve Jobs talked about, PCs as being trucks, and that the phone and the iPad were really like modern cars. And then Tim Cook, followed that up by saying, that you could converge a toaster and a refrigerator, but those are probably not going to be pleasing to the user. And of course, like, this just kills me, because he was really talking about Surface.
Oh, I'm sorry, Steven.
I know, well, but the funny thing is, like, here we are today, and, like, boy, the iPad looks a certain way that's not far off, and all sorts of things.
What does it mean, though, that there might no longer be this dividing line between consumption and productivity? What does that mean?
Well, that's the category that technologists of the world really grabbed onto when the iPad came out. And they said it's really good for consumption or for, quote, lightweight productivity. And the thing is that you can say that stuff all you want, but like all the people that only own phones, you can't say they're not doing any production. Like you can't, but they really are creating things, whether they're only creating movies or they're creating email or they're creating messages, they are creating. And what's really happened is that there's a set of software packages that people use that define their jobs that only work in the desktop environment. If you're an architect, AutoCAD runs on PCs, and those things aren't changing. With financial analysts with giant spreadsheets and giant calculated models of Excel using add-ins written in C++, they're on computers for a long time. And by my own guesstimate, there's like 300 million people that have jobs that require those kind of all-day products. And it just so happens one of those jobs is coding. Developers say things like, if your iPad can run Xcode, then it's not a real computer. And there's nothing written down that says coding defines what a computer is or isn't. But what's happened with the Mac now is it does the same thing to computing that like SUVs or minivans did to the car industry. Like when the minivan came out, vans were things that like delivery people had, and they were uncomfortable. And then the minivan said, well, we can take all the car things, build it on a car chassis, but puff it up so you could put people in it. And then it became like, well, is it a car or is it not a car? And then all of a sudden people were putting car-like capabilities on truck frames. It became like this very confusing world. Is it a car? Is it a truck? And what does it matter?
So what you've described is that this blurring of categories is an academic point. It's not just about the features, but the benefits that it actually has for consumers. You already talked about battery life. What are some of the other benefits specifically then for people?
So obviously battery life, which we talked about. Then there's going to be security. Like one of the biggest problems with both the PC and Macintosh today is you need a piece of software, you download it from the internet, Now, what Apple is able to do is like, look, we have the safe place to get software with the store. And the security stuff that you inherit in what's your Mac.
Right.
And then we run all the iPad apps. So for developers who say that the iPad is a consumption device, one of the things they always point to is, there are no overlapping windows, you can't have more than one thing on the screen. But now on the Mac, feel free to run like a bunch of iPad apps in Windows. As a consumer, it means you can get all these apps. Now developers can choose to make their iOS or iPadOS apps work on the Macintosh or not. That's a choice that they make when they publish their app to the store. So we'll see what happens. Like, famously, there will be an Instagram app for this device. There hasn't been one for the iPad. Finally, there's Macintosh apps. And Apple did really some brilliant work in the emulation that they call Rosetta, which is something that they worked on years ago in the Intel transition as well. And I can't really stress how good this work is. It's kind of mind-blowing. Because
Why does it matter?
Well, because what this does is it lets you take like your Mac software you have today, like your Office for Intel Macintosh, and just run it on these new
show Marvelous World, where we featured a conversation on that with surgeon Martin Macri, author of the book The Price We Pay. But in this episode, we dig into the specifics of these rules, as well as always, the gap between what's hype and what's real, with our A6MC bio experts Justin Larkin and general partner Julie Yu. Julie has also covered on other past episodes historic rules. They're all described as historic, by the way. And you can find these in the show notes or at a6MC.com/16 minutes. To quickly summarize these rules at a high level, they will require most employer group health plans and health insurance issuers to disclose price and cost-sharing information to participants, beneficiaries, and enrollees up front. The goal is to give patients accurate estimates of the cost that they are paying for, including making previously unavailable price information accessible to them and other stakeholders in a standardized way, allowing for easy comparisons and potential competition down the line. So, my first question for you guys, always the first question, is why does this matter? What's the big picture here?
Yeah, so ballooning costs in healthcare is basically the headline of what the industry's been focused on for decades. And the thing that has been controversial is who's actually responsible for those high costs. And one of the things that's powerful about this rule is that it is expressly pointing the finger at the hospitals and the insurance companies who have been negotiating these contracts behind closed doors. I think from a consumer lens, when we think about consuming services in the rest of our lives, our ability to shop, our ability to have choice are all things that we sort of take for granted. And this rule does set us on a path towards where we can shop for the best options and be guaranteed that we won't be hit by surprise bills. On the other hand, it can be viewed as a huge threat. Reimbursement is the tail that wags the dog in healthcare. The vast majority of revenue that flows through our healthcare system is in the form of reimbursed revenue. And to get into the game of healthcare, a lot of it is all about what kinds of contracts can you negotiate with insurance companies. Hospitals clearly consider those contracts their crown jewels. And this rule represents a really interesting paradox in healthcare, which is the notion of a top-down mandate that compels business entities to disclose the terms of what they would consider highly proprietary contracts is actually antithetical in many ways to the way that efficient markets should work. And so I think that healthy tension is going to be the source of much of the agitation that plays out with regards to this rule.
Yeah, in no other aspect of our financial lives would we ever imagine going and engaging in service where we didn't know the price, and there are unique aspects of healthcare that are just different and require a higher level of transparency. Things like the magnitude of cost, the complexity of the cost sharing. There are deductibles, there are co-payments, there are co-insurances, there's in-network, out-of-network. All of these things create this immensely challenging environment for folks to make rational, informed decisions. And then you have on top of that the variability of the cost, where I could go out and search for a completely commoditized healthcare service, and there could be a 3, 5, 10x swing in the price of that, blocks away from each other, purely on the basis of some of the obscurity that's existed in the healthcare system. This topic hits extremely close to home for us. We have a son that required a major surgery, major ICU stay early on in his life. And after hearing a number of families be nearly bankrupted from similar experiences, we tried to get a sense of how much it would cost. So we called our insurer. They couldn't give us a ballpark figure, so they referred us to the hospital to get their financial services team to give us a perspective. They couldn't give us a figure. They referred us back to the insurer. At the end, all we knew is that we were expecting somewhere north of $1 million. But we had no idea if we would owe $500, $5,000, $150,000 at the end of that. And I remember walking away from this experience just thinking, even as a physician, even as someone who spends all day, every day working in healthcare, even after spending hours and hours on the phone with providers in our health plan, I couldn't get to an answer. Luckily, we ended up on the better end of that spectrum, but there's something fundamentally wrong there.
Wow, there really is. And thank you for sharing that story, Justin, which is unfortunately way, way too commonplace for many, many people. And not all of them even have the resources or ability to kind of understand what's going on necessarily. They're from a different country, don't understand the language. There's all kinds of factors at play. Julie, you've actually described some of these dynamics, the quote, dark art of payer contracts. The question I have for you is, why was it so hard for Justin to find that information? Why is this such a shadow system where prices are hidden?
So a couple things. One is that for a complex surgical encounter like the one that Justin described, there are legitimately a set of services that you may not anticipate you need when a patient comes in, but it's even hard for hospitals to understand their cost structure to begin with. The notion of even like cost-based accounting in any provider organization is pretty rare that you hear that these organizations have a handle on exactly what it does cost on a unit basis for a single service or a single procedure to be delivered. And there just really hasn't been incentive to do that. The other aspect of these contracts is that a lot of it is really predicated on market power. And you oftentimes hear hospitals compared to like cartels. You hear all about consolidation that's happened across the market, which is actually ironically accelerated with the advent of value-based care being viewed as a threat to the traditional fee-for-service revenue streams. A lot of the response to that has been we got to aggregate more volume such that we can more aggressively negotiate with insurance companies for higher prices. That's actually one of the major dynamics. The most dominant hospitals in a given market do have a tremendous amount of leverage, and the combination of that with a lack of clear understanding of their cost structure is a lot of what's pushed those prices up.
Absolutely. The complexity of the cost structure of hospitals is a key piece of this. But one of the other components, and this is where the earlier ruling on price transparency that was hospital-centric somewhat came short, is that knowing the price that a given hospital is going to charge to your insurance is only a piece of the puzzle. The other piece of price transparency for consumers is what is your personal responsibility against that price. And we've talked to a number of different health system partners who have wanted to be able to provide upfront cost estimates for their patients, but there's this complexity of where they have to interact with the payer to then understand, okay, what's this patient-specific deductible? What's their specific copay? How much have they already paid on their deductible? At the end of the day, it's the health plan and the insurer that owns really the financial relationship with the patient. There is obviously bills that will come from the health systems themselves, but it's the health plan that determines how much they're going to pay the health system. And so I think what's elegant about this new final rule is that it really shifts the focus to the payer, where they do have the transparency and understanding of the price that they've negotiated and where that individual is at in their journey. So they can say, this is the price and you already paid $400 on your deductible, so your responsibility is $600.
Yeah, I think it's notable to consider this rule in conjunction with the hospital rule because the hospital rules had gaps. One example was actually that the hospital rule specifically did not include non-employed physicians in its mandate. And it's often had the case that health systems, their medical staff is actually sometimes largely comprised of just contractors or affiliate providers who are not actually on the employed payroll of the hospital. And that's where you see these examples of if I go in for a procedure, even if that facility and the main surgeon on my case is in network with my insurance, there might be an anesthesiologist or some other ancillary provider who's not. And that's really where those surprise bills comes in. And so when you combine that with the insurance-oriented rule, that's where you get that air cover and that coverage of all of these sort of corner cases that weren't explicitly addressed by the hospital side of the equation.
What is the difference in price and cost? In my head, they're kind of intertwined and quite confusing, in fact. It would help a lot to have you really break down the difference between price and cost when it comes to the healthcare system.
Yeah, no, I mean, I feel the same way. The way that people use those terms is interchangeable, where they're certainly not. And there are probably two legitimate interpretations of price versus cost. So one is the cost to the hospital. So if I'm a provider providing the service, like how much outlay do I need to make to actually even deliver the service? That is a traditional definition of cost and like cost structure in the business sense. Whereas price in that case would be the price that I, the provider, charge to whomever will pay. And that could be a combination of the insurance and the individual consumer. So that would be more of a traditional definition of price versus cost. Now, the way that cost is used in certain clauses of this particular rule is actually the cost to the consumer. And so that is the out-of-pocket cost, how much I, as a consumer, ultimately need to pay, in addition to any coverage that I get through my insurance company. And I think that's where a lot of the confusion comes, is that you're sort of using that term interchangeably in two different scenarios. Price is a very, very important component of what needs to have transparency here, but cost is equally important. And a lot of the reason I would argue that costs have ballooned out of control is negotiations between providers and insurance companies have largely been price-driven. Marty talked about this on our podcast together. Hospitals inherently assume that whatever price they put in front of an insurance company will immediately get discounted and that they'll only essentially earn like a small percentage of that. And so they explicitly mark up the price that they put in front of the payer. And that just starts this vicious cycle of back and forth that ultimately leads to higher and higher prices over time.
And by the way, I think the line he used in that podcast is sort of markup, discount, markup, discount, markup, discount, markup, discount. That's the sound effect that goes with that vicious cycle you just described. So now let's tease apart, as is the premise of this show, what's hype, what's real. So first of all, I have to call BS, which is you both said this, the rule said this, the coverage says this. Does this really truly mean no surprise healthcare bills? It seems healthcare is way too complex to actually guarantee that requirement. Can you guys help me piece apart what's real there?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think that's one of the dangers of any kind of price transparency rule is you can get this false sense that, oh, I know all of my costs, and I still get surprised at the end of the day. Going back to Julie's point earlier, that was one of the biggest challenges with the hospital-focused iteration of this. But what I will say is that a payer-centric iteration of this gets a lot closer to solving that issue, and that not only does it capture some of those issues with in-network provider, out-of-network provider, and what your coverage would be in each of those environments, but even gets down to being able to predict price against prescription medications, and even things like durable medical equipment. So a lot of these things that in the past could have driven a lot of unexpected costs are now captured within the rule. The last piece of it, the requirement for the health plans to create a place where consumers could interact with that information. So it's not just a PDF or a flat file sitting in some archive somewhere.
Specifically, what you're talking about is that out-of-network allowed machine-readable file. And the machine-readable file must include specific things, including billing code, amounts, bill charges, etc. There's also prescription drug machine-readable file. They even outline the specific things that each of those files have to include. Really glad you brought that up.
The question becomes, in the implementation of this, are folks able to gather that data and present it in a way that patients can internalize it, make decisions against it? Because it's not just about having the data, but really putting it into practice.
And I would add there's a very important distinction between shoppable and non-shoppable services, which is distinct from the concept of transparency. Because if you end up in the emergency room and you had no control over what services were provided or needed, then any price will likely be a surprise. It's also worth noting that there are a separate set of legislations around surprise billing specifically. There were 16 overall provisions that the CMS put into place around price transparency in general, one of which related to surprise billing, and then you have these two with regards to price transparency. The last thing I'll say, though, and important to note about the timing of the individual clauses of this rule, is that the requirements span from 2022 through 2024. The one that's actually patient-facing, so the tool that Justin described that would allow me as a consumer to go to a website and actually look up not only the price, but also what my out-of-pocket responsibility is, that's actually not required to be in place until 2024. One of the risks here is how much will that clause get diluted between now and then, but we also have some other agendas that come into play. So I think that's probably the most relevant part for individual consumers, but that's like the last piece to fall into place.
So, given that timing, that of course begs the most important next question, which is, how does this play out in practice, like actual implementation? Because again, this is something that's announced, it's a press release, it's got news coverage. What is practically necessary to actually get us there?
I think there are a couple of different angles that's important to consider. One is the patient perspective, and the other is the health plan perspective. And on the patient side, something we've seen with other price transparencies efforts, the price is certainly an important piece. But you got to understand that people will often equate price with value, price with quality. And so there's this whole kind of parallel conversation about it's not just enough to have price alone, but really we need to pull in the data sets and the pieces of information to guide folks on not only what is the best price, but where can you get a good price for high quality healthcare service. And so it's one key portion of the decision here. The other side, which is arguably even more complex, is the health plan side. And Julie alluded to this early on, where there will undoubtedly be resistance. And we have seen that with the hospital version of this, where various bodies took the rule to court. And you add on top of that the oversight regulatory complexity here, where there are various bodies that oversee different types of health plans. So if I'm on a fully insured plan through my employer or a smaller employer, that might be under the oversight of state insurance regulators, where if I'm on a self-insured plan through a larger employer, that might be under the Department of Labor. If I'm on the federal employee plan, that might be the Office of Personal Management. So at the end of the day, we're hopeful that this can have teeth and take hold, but it's not going to be a light switch. It's going to be a longer process.
Yeah, there was a pretty big whiplash reaction from the hospital trade groups around the prior hospital policies. It's interesting to read the response from AHIP, which is the major trade group for the insurance industry, it's America's health insurance plans. You know, they made a number of rebuttals against this rule. The central argument from them is that price transparency would actually result in higher premiums and prices for consumers. They also claim that the majority of health plans are already offering price transparency tools, and therefore it's unnecessary to apply additional burden. And so to actually check on that second claim, I actually went to my insurance website. There is a cost transparency tool, to their credit. However, when you search for actual procedures, every single result basically gave me a message that said, cost is not available, please call the number back of your card. So there is still a delta between the implementation of the tool versus the actual content that's delivered through that tool. The other kind of hilarious response that I remember from the hospital version of this was from the AHA when they complained that complying with this would require spreadsheets with hundreds of thousands of columns, and such files could crash most standard computer systems. And again, so much of the efforts that CMS, and to their credit, have made is like, how do we just modernize the entire infrastructure of this industry? And if this is the way by which we compel these parties to upgrade their version of Microsoft Excel, then so be it.
So it's really interesting, Julie, because you're basically describing this arc of technology evolution where hospitals, we joke about them being on very old operating systems, but most consumers are way past those systems. Forget even the evolution from old PCs. They're in the mobile world where they're used to things that are very consumable, very accessible, great UIs. So my question for you, how much do you really think that consumers actually want to consume their healthcare information in this way once it's made machine readable, especially because most people barely even understand their credit score. So I'm curious for your thoughts on what's necessary or what needs to happen.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question because there are so many players in this equation, right? And consumers are certainly a critical and central and important one, but perhaps the bigger profound impact that this type of rule has is actually around the behaviors of how hospitals and insurance companies treat each other as trade partners. That actually might be the place where we see the biggest impact. Will this actually change the way by which insurance companies and providers negotiate price? Which should, in theory, filter down to the ultimate premiums that we pay and how the actual insurance products that we consume are designed. Maybe that's where the bigger lever of influence is. And then maybe another way to sort of look at this rule, and something that came to mind as I was looking at is when you think about hospitals as kind of the entrenched incumbents versus the underdogs in the market, like the independent practice groups, the ambulatory surgical centers, et cetera. For the last several years, they have been publishing price. They've already been doing a lot of this. And so as business goes away from these ill-paid hospitals into these more transparent, lower acuity settings, where their cost structure inherently is lower, that actually to me is perhaps like the most powerful way to address this problem, is to actually like literally compete in the market by arming the more nimble players with a mandate that they can actually implement.
It might even mean more new hospitals, interestingly.
Yeah, and they'll be fundamentally different in structure than the hospitals of today.
But the other piece is too is just as what opens up the door to a lot of opportunity for builders out there. There is invitation in this rule for third parties to come in and help to build those products that folks would need to really make this actionable. What are the plan designs that could be built on top of more transparency that would then incent people to make decisions that are right for them? And importantly also, what is the research and policy that could happen on top of all of this? And so I agree that the rule in isolation on its own doesn't solve all the problem here, but it does invite the opportunity for the macro players to have to adjust and also for there to be an ecosystem that's built up around it.
It's interesting to draw the analogies between this and other industries. Price transparency and even like dynamic pricing has been a thing for decades, whether it's e-commerce, whether it's the travel industry. I used to build software for the e-commerce industry in the early part of my career, and there's entire companies who are dedicated to providing robust pricing engines. You can build like custom catalogs where you have all sorts of different permutations per SKU as to how you price things. Obviously, the most complex form of this is in the airline industry, where you have actual dynamic pricing that change in real time based on actual capacity and whatnot. You know, Amazon has hundreds of millions of SKUs. When you compare that to what the provider and insurance companies will have to deal with, there are less than 20,000 CPT codes. So CPT codes are the codes that sort of dictate what services you can bill for. But you just limit that, for instance, to the shoppable services. You're talking about like hundreds of codes, and there are roughly 6,000 hospitals in this country. And so even if you were to have a single price per hospital for every possible service that's provided, you're talking about like maybe 10 million lines of data. And it's embarrassing that we would, as an industry, make an excuse that we couldn't handle that. So I do think that there's a lot to be said about the opportunity for tech companies to enable these hospital systems to actually implement that in a very cost-effective way, because another argument from the industry is saying it's going to be millions of dollars to stand up a system that can produce this kind of data file. That's absolutely not the case, just given the cost-effective SaaS-type tooling that we now have available to us in other industries.
So one last question about
Ah, eu acho que não é da geração dele, não.
the whole point of all these dynamics is to
Me lembra Neo Nippon, mas sem o Kaiju Tanuki. Ah, kawaii!
cobaias. Mas você sabe, omelete e ovo. Poção super poderosa, marsúpia